It's Dave and Evelyn from the Camera Store, and today we have a rendition of Battle of the Sixes.
So a little while ago we did the Battle of the Sixes with the original Canon R6 versus the Z6 II from Nikon, and we had some pretty interesting results on that case.
Yeah, this is kind of the mid-range of full-frame cameras. So cameras that have a lot of interesting features, but they're not the top of their lineup. And so we want to see, how do these cameras compare, especially because the Nikon right now, it's brand new. The Canon's actually about 2 years old, and there's a bit of a price delta, especially because we're starting to see the Canon R6 Mark II go on sale.
So we're going to put the new 6s to the test and see how they hold up.
First category, let's talk about handling and design. This is super important because you are going to be holding this camera and you want to make sure it feels good and it also looks good. And this is where I think the Nikon wins a little bit in this department. The sleek lines that Nikon offers in their mirrorless cameras and just the feel of it, the ergonomics, I think are really good, where Canon has a little bit more of a more rounded approach to their design.
I mean, Canon has a very classic design. They've had it for a while. If you're picking up the original R6, it feels right at home if you're using this. They have switched some dials around. The R6 II now has the on-off button above the shutter button here, which is quite convenient. It's just awkwardly enough out of the way, but you can still use one finger to turn the camera on or off with a single hand, which is nice. Where Nikon always puts their on-off switch on the shutter button.
On the shutter button.
So,
which I like too. I think it's really easy to keep that separate because you don't have to turn your camera on and off very often because it will go into sleep mode. But you know, in terms of the look of the camera, I think that the sleek lines on the Nikon Z6 III gives it a little bit of an edge. I think it's a bit sexier of a camera.
no, I mean, I like the design of the Canon camera. I find them very logical. I do like they both have articulating screens now. You have a nice little top screen there, which may or may not be used very often.
Oh yes. Now I do like having the top screen, especially if you're doing something like you're photographing wildlife, you're getting nice and low, you're photographing kids and stuff like that, you can control that top dial. But I did notice I don't have the triple dials to do the camera setting control. So when I want to adjust my exposure in manual, I did enjoy the Canon a little bit more.
Canon's great that way. You put it in full manual and you have a little icon above each one of the parameters you want to change, and they're readily available at your fingertips. I don't need to push a button and dial it in.
Yeah.
Now, the other thing I have to say is that they both have articulating screens. They're both touch screens, but the Canon's interface is so much cleaner and nicer, I find, than the Nikon.
Yeah, your touch screen seems very responsive, but I do have to say it is pretty cool. This is a new trick feature where if you are shooting in portrait orientation, you're locked down on a tripod, your entire user interface also follows you, so you have everything in that vertical orientation. And especially now with creating content so much more so for vertical, I think that this is a really cool nifty feature that Nikon's included. And the biggest difference here has to do with the experience of using it. And that comes down to the electronic viewfinder. I have a higher resolution, gorgeous, super bright electronic viewfinder on the Z6 III. And tonight when we're shooting into the sunlight in brighter conditions, I really noticed that the resolution on the Canon wasn't that same experience.
There is a noticeable difference between the two, but the Canon's 3.6 million dot resolution is great. I mean, honestly, we've been using it for a long time.
Yeah.
It is just
But
fine. So, but you got 2 years on the Canon. So,
but that experience of using this electronic viewfinder is pretty game-changing. I hate saying that, but it is. It's a very different experience.
Yeah.
Another very important thing that has to do with the design of the camera is the actual media that you can use in the camera. And this is going to tie in to some of the feature sets later on. So the Nikon has a CF Express Type B card slot, and it has a UHS 2 compatible SD card slot.
yeah, I mean, where the Canon has dual SD cards, and they're just great. I don't have no trouble with it at all. I get really torn. I get really torn because I like having two of the same cards for the camera.
Yes.
I would be happier if the Nikon came with 2 CF Express cards, because those CF Express cards are so fast now. And it's not just shooting the camera, it's offloading the images. I'm finding when I'm shooting all the stuff we've done for this episode, right? I'm always fine. Just throw that on there, right? This takes much longer to download the images. The CF Express cards are fantastic.
They are a fantastic media.
But it's 2 card slots.
It is.
It
is 2 different kind of card slots. And because of that, perhaps this is why your camera actually might have an edge when it comes to having video redundancy. We're going to talk a little bit more about that when we get into video, but the Z6 III surprisingly doesn't give you the ability to record video to a redundant card. And so that's kind of one area where the Canon has a leg up when it comes to media.
All right, we've come back for day 2 of comparing these 2 cameras, back to the farm, check things out and talk about image quality between these 2 cameras.
Yeah, image quality is probably one of the most important things to look at when you're choosing a camera because it's going to make your output. Now, both of these on paper are very similar. They're 24 megapixel full frame cameras, and they're really designed to be kind of an all-around good camera. So we're going to get into performance after this, but for right now, we just want to talk about how are these going to perform in terms of what your actual output is in a variety of shooting situations.
Yeah, now 24 megapixels isn't the highest resolution on the market. You certainly can go in both brands, significantly higher resolution, but 24 megapixels is great. It's all we really need for the vast majority of uses.
Now, the biggest difference between these, of course, is that the Nikon has a partially stacked sensor. And you've probably heard or read about that a stacked sensor does lose some dynamic range. Now, because this is partially stacked, this is pretty minimal overall, but it does have some interesting improvements in terms of the capability. For example, when I'm shooting with the Z6 III, I don't lose any bit depth if I'm switching between the mechanical shutter or the electronic. So it's 14-bit files for both of those modes.
Now, it's interesting you say that. However, let's say I want a little more dynamic range. If I'm shooting mechanical shutter with the R6 Mark II, I have about a stop better dynamic range up to 800 ISO. But if I go into electronic shutter, I am doing 12-bit, certainly lose a little bit there. But at the beginning, I do have a little more dynamic range.
A little bit more to start with. Now, if we're talking about the difference between mechanical and electronic, the Nikon actually has a higher frames per second for mechanical shooting. You can shoot up to 14 frames per second, and you can only shoot up to 12.
Well, that's cute, but I can go into electronic. If I'm shooting more fleeting moments, I can shoot electronic shutter up to 40 frames per second, which blows away the Nikon.
That's true. It's double the frame rate speed for electronic. But as one other little caveat to make it even more confusing, the Nikon has a much deeper buffer. This is partially because of the type of media. We have that CF Express Type B card in the camera, and so you can pretty much shoot indefinitely. There's no limit to the buffer.
Yeah, I mean, I've been using both these cameras quite extensively for the last little while, including shooting football, which is a very fleeting moment. Now it's grade 10 football, nothing stellar, right? But it's a lot of fun to shoot and try and get some good shots with it. And both cameras worked exceptionally well. But I found I like having a little faster frame rate because those tiny little fleeting moments, having the extra burst is certainly there. And neither camera, I worried about the buffer at all. I was able to shoot the sequences without a problem.
Yeah, another thing that we should mention is pre-capture. Yes, both have the ability to shoot pre-capture. However, yours puts it into like this container file, and you have to use either the Canon software or in camera to pull out the images when you shoot pre-capture.
Yeah, and yours, you can only shoot in JPEG if you're doing pre-capture.
I was hoping you were going to forget about that one. That's true. I am limited to only getting JPEGs for pre-capture.
I mean, overall, as far as image quality goes, both cameras deliver a really, really nice quality. Now, I actually prefer the colors in JPEG out of camera from the Canon over the Nikon, but it's subtle. I mean, I think Nikon's made some big strides.
Yeah, I like the look of the files that come out of Nikon JPEG, and I find that the RAW files are easy to work with as well. And even though we are getting a little bit of a loss of dynamic range, I would take that loss in order to get the faster scanning sensor, the less rolling shutter than you have in electronic.
Now that being said, I've shot all kinds of stuff with this, and it's a very fast scanning sensor, not as fast as this partially stacked sensor. And anything human powered, I haven't really encountered any rolling shutter. I'm okay with it. But if you push it to the extreme, yes, you'll certainly see a little bit compared to what you're getting with the Nikon.
Okay, Dave, well, let's get into autofocus. One of the things that is obviously under a lot of contention, the brand's been battling it out over the last few years, is autofocus performance and the use of using machine learning to program autofocus systems to be as intuitive as possible. Now, we're, of course, here at the farm. We're in the hangar. We wanted to see what we had at our disposal in order to do some autofocus tests. Last time, you guys did like a scooter in the city.
Death-defying scooter races over there. Hey, no.
We had Bailey and Lincoln hop on their vintage dirt bikes, so we could do a side-by-side test. So we both were beside each other. We set the cameras up as best we could for this scenario, and we were able to lock off some pretty good shots.
Okay, now Evelyn, in the original Battle of the Sixes that we did, the Canon at the time did a much, much better job than the Nikon. Just blew it away as far as the autofocus performance went. Yeah. Has the Nikon gotten much better?
Oh yeah, the Nikon system has improved dramatically. So this generation of cameras, the Z8, the Z9, and now the Z6 III, have become so much better than they used to be with the Z6 II and Z7 II. We're seeing great autofocus performance out of the box. I think that the automated and AI-based settings really do a good job of being intuitive, so you can just focus on composing your image instead of worrying about, fiddling around with your autofocus settings.
Yeah, I mean, the Canon has a lot more autofocus points. I mean, there's 4,900 autofocus points to compare to your 299, but how does that really rank in the real world, in world uses there? So, I mean, I've taken this out and I was shooting football with both these cameras side by side, same settings, same everything, and I was hopefully trying to find which was superior, which one gave me a performance edge. And quite honestly, they both performed fantastic. What I found is that Nikon didn't take as much to set up to get really good quality results. I was able to auto-detect much further away. With the Canon, I had to go through a couple more steps to really get the performance I wanted. But once it was there, both of them are fantastic.
Yeah, and that's something to be said for the Canon being a 2-year-old camera. It's able to really keep up. And I mean, it just goes to show how far along Canon was a couple of years ago and where Nikon kind of is today. So both are going to perform really well, and it's going to come down to what you're shooting and how much you like to finesse it. I still think Canon's user interface is a little bit better, but Nikon, I do trust the automated settings right out of the box.
I mean, taking both these cameras out, I was more screwed up with the lenses zooming opposite directions of each other. I don't know why the manufacturers don't make all the lenses zoom the same direction.
YouTube reviewer problems, yeah. So that's something you normally have to deal with. They're both fabulous autofocus cameras, and if you're, again, someone coming from an old DSLR camera or even an older mirrorless camera from a few years ago, autofocus is improving day after day. Every time they release a new camera, it's just that much better, and you really have to stop worrying about your autofocus, focus on your composition, because I don't ever find that I'm missing shots with all these current generation cameras.
All right, so the world has got a lot more hybrid now, and we want to shoot stills and video when it comes to all of the equipment we have. And both these cameras are pretty well equipped as far as the physical side goes, right? The articulating screen makes shooting video quite nice. They both have a headphone jack, both have a microphone jack, very important for getting good quality audio.
IBIS.
And IBIS as well, which is fantastic. And the Canon R6 II will shoot 4K 60 in 265, which is very good.
It is good. However, the Nikon camera just has so much more flexibility, period. And I think, again, it goes back to the type of media that's in this camera. We have that CF Express Type B card. And the Nikon camera also can shoot 6K. It has raw internal. You can do it, but you have to do it with external recorder. And I can shoot in H.264 files, which are larger. They're going to take up more space. However, on my computer, I don't have to edit in proxy files. I really like working with those kinds of files. I also have 240 HD, which no other Nikon camera or the R6 II have. And so as far as video functionality goes, the Z6 III just has a ton more flexibility. There's like a whole menu dedicated to all of the different options, where Canon is just a lot more limited. And I think it comes down to the media. The only thing I will say, Dave, that you have that I don't is the ability to do video redundancy. So because I have the two different cards, the SD UHS 2 card slot and that CF Express Type B card slot, I do not have the ability to have video redundancy. So if I'm filming like a wedding or super important event, the Canon has a little bit of an edge, only because you can do the backup to the second card.
Yeah, that's a pretty small edge, I have to admit.
It is, but it's use case, right? Like if you're someone that always wants to have video redundancy, then, you know, I can plug in a secondary recorder and I can definitely set something up. But if you just want to go like run and gun camera only, then that's something to consider.
I mean, I think we're looking at the Nikons kind of like a slam dunk when it comes to the video.
Oh yeah.
But more so on the higher end video users are going to take advantage of that. If you are more of a
Or
recreational,
someone that really wants to grow, yeah, with their
that.
editing
But
abilities.
I mean, the video quality out of the R6 II is fantastic, right?
Yeah,
But
looks
as long as
good.
you stay within the limits of what it's able to produce, that's great. But the more demanding videographers are certainly going to use the Z6 III. It's going to give you a higher performance, that aspect. All right, Evelyn, we've been with this episode for quite some time, and we've been working both these cameras really hard to try and find out
so hard, yeah.
who is superior as the new battle of the sixes, who's the definitive winner. Honestly, we're so spoiled with both these cameras and the performance we're able to get. I mean, I pushed these cameras shooting fireworks, just general purpose photography, shooting sports and action, and I wasn't able to determine which was a clear-cut winner, which is kind of odd for me. Usually there's one factor that pushes me over the edge. Now, I'm not as big into video, so maybe that's the reason I'm, leaning sort of, I'm not really sure. I'm like 49% Nikon, 51% Canon. I don't really know.
Ooh,
I guess
that's
back
tight,
and forth.
Dave.
It's back and forth.
There's going to be pros and cons to both of them. Now, what I like about the Nikon overall as being like the ultimate hybrid tool is because you have a lot more flexibility for video. I think when it comes down to the actual processing power, the video specs are what we're looking at. We're having reduced rolling shutter, and I like that you don't lose your bit depth when you switch between mechanical and electronic. Those to me are the biggest wins with this camera, and I think it's just damn sexy. This is a good looking streaming camera, where, you know, the Canon's a little more...
Nikon's stepping it up, and they've taken the design cues from the Z8 and the Z9. I mean, this is the new generation of Nikon, and they're performing really well. And the autofocus is significantly better than its predecessor.
Yeah, there's no autofocus concerns that we would have had with the previous generation cameras.
Now, for me, I prefer the Canon a little bit more than the Nikon. It is pretty close, but that little extra stop at dynamic range at the lower ISO certainly pays off. But I also like the ability to shoot 40 frames per second and have that ability for those fleeting moments. I just don't have that option when it comes to the Nikon. Overall, the color I find out Canon I prefer a little bit more, but we are really close between these two cameras. And honestly, I'm enjoying shooting both of them, and I would have no trouble investing in either one. But I think you need to look at more than just the camera body itself. Look at the whole lineup of lenses, where things are going, and as we're getting really excited.
Yeah, and again, we can't deny that the Canon camera is a couple years old, so you're more likely to find a good deal on it. There's a bit of a price delta right now as we're releasing this video because the Canon camera is on sale right now. So it is something to consider when you're looking at cameras. Who knows what Canon's going to come up with next? Maybe we'll have to do this all over again sooner rather than later. But in the meantime, we really want to know, what are your thoughts on these two cameras? Are you Team Nikon or Team Canon when it comes to these mid-range full-frame cameras? Let us know in the comments below.
Make sure you follow us both on Instagram.
Make sure you subscribe, and it's been Dave and Evelyn from The Camera Store, and we'll catch you again very soon.
Hey, hope you enjoyed watching this Battle of the Sixes Part 2. If you want to check out more of our recent content, click up here. If you're Canadian and want to shop local, check out thecamerastore.com down here.